I was being handcuffed next to my tomato vines when it happened. Karen, the self-declared supreme ruler of our HOA, actually clapped as the police clicked the cuffs around my wrist. "That'll teach you to run an illegal farming operation," she shrieked, like I was growing moonshine and moon missiles instead of kale and cucumbers. The cherry on top? She live-streamed the whole thing with the caption, "Neighborhood agro-criminal caught." I didn't say much, just smiled. Because what Karen didn't know, what no one watching that train wreck of a livestream knew, was that I'm the state agricultural commissioner, and her little stunt had just turned into a statewide disaster for her. My name's Dale Morton. I've worked across every county in this state from grain silos to soil legislation, and I've spent over 2 decades defending farmers' rights from petty regulations and overreaching bureaucrats. So when I bought a small property in a quiet HOA suburb and decided to grow a little food for my own family, I didn't expect that the biggest threat to food security would come wearing a pink tracksuit and swinging a clipboard. I kept things clean, quiet, and respectful. My little backyard garden was a modest thing, more raised beds than sprawling fields. A couple chickens, a few vertical vine trellises, and yes, one very proud compost bin named Greg. It was all going fine until Karen took office as HOA president. From the moment she saw a carrot peeking out of the soil, it was war. First came the violation notices. Unauthorized agricultural activity. Then the fines. $25 one day, $75 the next. I appealed. She denied it. I quoted state exemption laws for personal agricultural use. She said, and I quote, "Not in my neighborhood." Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was an architect of control. Every week she invented new infractions. Grass too green? Must be artificial. Chicken coop too clean? Must be illegal. By the second month, she was circling my backyard with binoculars like I was some kind of homeland security risk. One Thursday morning, as I was harvesting cherry tomatoes with my niece, Karen appeared at the fence holding her phone like a weapon. She was filming again. "Documenting ongoing violations," she barked. My niece, confused, offered her a fresh cucumber. Karen looked like it had personally insulted her. "That's an unlicensed vegetable," she snapped. The cucumber dropped. My jaw almost did too. Later that day, she marched into my property uninvited, flanked by 2 men in reflective vests who I'd only ever seen handing out parking tickets at the mall. "These are my private enforcers," she announced. "We're shutting this down." She pointed to my planter boxes. "This is an unauthorized agricultural zone." I calmly informed her that trespassing and impersonating law enforcement were both crimes. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out a stack of faux legal documents labeled HOA Order of Cessation. When I didn't comply, she called the police. Here's the wild part. The cops actually came. Apparently, she told them I was cultivating banned substances and possibly hiding undocumented farm workers. I couldn't believe it. The responding officers looked baffled when they saw squash and sunflowers instead of drugs and chaos, but Karen was waving her phone like a conductor's baton. "Right there. Those chickens are weapons grade." I tried reasoning with the officers. I told them I was the agricultural commissioner, that this was my personal residence, and everything here was legally permitted and state certified. But they'd been called on a potential felony agriculture violation. Karen had said I had modified rootstocks, whatever that meant, and they had to follow through. I was as cooperative as I could be, and even joked, "This has to be the first time a commissioner gets cuffed over compost." The rookie officer actually chuckled before Karen glared him down. So there I was, standing beside my lettuce patch in a button-down shirt, hands behind my back, while Karen live-streamed like she'd just brought down El Chapo. "Let this be a warning," she yelled to the camera, "you can't just grow things wherever you want." A neighbor watching from across the fence shouted, "He's growing tomatoes, Karen!" But she ignored it. I was loaded into the back of the cruiser and driven off while the chickens watched in stunned silence. At the station, everything changed. The moment I handed over my credentials, the desk sergeant's eyebrows practically flew off his face. He called in the lieutenant. They made a few phone calls to confirm my identity, and when they did, the vibe shifted like a gear change in a drag race. I was uncuffed in seconds. Apologies flew faster than summer gnat. One officer even offered me coffee, which I politely declined in favor of getting back to Greg the compost bin. But I wasn't angry. Not really. I was entertained. Because I knew what was coming next. And Karen was about to learn what happens when you cross the wrong guy with the right connections and a legal arsenal. See, HOA rules are fine when they're fair. But when they try to override state agricultural policy, that's where I come in. I'd seen HOAs bully homeowners before, usually with threats and bad paperwork. But this was new. She weaponized ignorance, lies, and personal bias to harass someone she didn't like. And now, she'd done it to a state-level official. I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to fertilize my lawn with the shredded remains of her nonsense regulations. As I stepped out of the precinct into the sunlight, I called my office. Yeah, it's Dale. Spin up a full audit on the Green Hills HOA. Water usage, zoning compliance, everything. Let's see if Karen's backyard is as regulation compliant as she thinks. My deputy laughed and said, I've been waiting for this day for years. I drove home with a smirk, already planning what new crops I'd plant just to mess with her. Maybe corn. Tall enough to block her view. Maybe a beehive. Legally protected, wonderfully noisy. Either way, I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to host the most epic, state-approved, HOA-infuriating farm festival this neighborhood had ever seen. And Karen? She had no idea what she'd just planted. The morning after my unexpected arrest, my phone buzzed non-stop like a bee swarm in peak bloom. News had traveled fast. A clip of Karen screaming illegal lettuce was making the rounds on local social media pages. One guy had even edited in dramatic courtroom music and labeled it Karen vs. the State, Farmageddon. But while the internet laughed, I was busy preparing my next move, something Karen could never prepare for. She had poked the bear, and the bear had access to a full squad of state auditors with nothing better to do during a budget lull. I made the first call before breakfast. My assistant Lindsay picked up on the first ring. Hey Dale, I saw the clip. Was that seriously you getting arrested over cucumbers? I sighed. Yep. Can you mobilize Compliance Division? Green Hills HOA. Full-scale agricultural audit. And get me a file on Karen Whitmore. President, local HOA chapter. I want to know everything: landscape permits, pesticide records, irrigation logs, water rights, all of it. She whistled. Going nuclear, huh? She made it personal. Time to return the favor, officially. Meanwhile, Karen was busy trying to twist the narrative. She sent out a community-wide email with the subject, "Why I did the right thing." It was 5 pages long and somehow managed to insult farmers, immigrants, environmentalists, and kale in one unhinged paragraph. She wrote about how urban farming creates dangerous biozones, and how she had heroically protected the neighborhood from a potential agricultural uprising. Most neighbors rolled their eyes. Some started forwarding me the email with subject lines like, "Queen Compost has spoken," and "Our HOA needs a psychiatric auditor next." But Karen wasn't done. The same day, she called an emergency HOA board meeting. Naturally, I went. I walked in wearing my state agricultural commissioner badge clipped proudly to my jacket, and the entire room fell silent like someone had pulled the power cord. Karen tried to act composed, but her twitchy eye betrayed her. "Mr. Morton," she began, with a voice sharp enough to slice zucchini, "I don't know what you're doing here." I cut her off. As the state official responsible for all agriculture-related zoning and regulatory compliance, I'm here to review your HOA's practices. Starting today. A man in the corner snorted so loudly he had to fake a cough. Karen fumbled through a stack of folders and said something about having nothing to hide. Perfect. I pulled out a printed list with 5 state violations already flagged: excessive use of fertilizer within 5 feet of the community pond, unauthorized pesticide use near the dog park, and a suspicious irrigation reroute that benefited Karen's own lawn more than the others combined. Her eyes darted across the room, seeking backup. None came. Even the treasurer, a guy named Bill who always nodded like a bobblehead, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor tiles. That same afternoon, our state compliance trucks rolled in like a small fleet of agricultural avengers. They wore khaki uniforms, carried clipboards, and took soil samples with surgical precision. One of them set up a drone to scan the HOA landscaping layout. Another found a suspicious greenhouse setup in Karen's backyard. That's when it got juicy. Hidden behind a tarp and a suspiciously high fence were rows of rare orchids, many of which were marked prohibited resale species, under a state regulation passed just last year. Karen, who had just lectured the community on unauthorized plant growth, had essentially built a black market flower bazaar in her yard. News spread faster than wildfire. A few neighbors even peeked over her fence with binoculars while sipping lemonade like they were watching a reality TV episode unfold live. Someone posted a photo of the orchid discovery online with the caption, "Karen's Secret Garden, sponsored by Hypocrisy." Meanwhile, our inspection team found even more violations. HOA landscaping contracts showed major discrepancies. Funds marked for community beautification were used almost exclusively on Karen's property. One receipt included a $1,300 custom butterfly wall that no one had ever seen, until we found it in her backyard behind a locked gate labeled Private HOA Staff Only. I hadn't even scratched the surface yet. As if on cue, a local reporter showed up with a camera crew. He asked if I'd be willing to make a statement on the investigation. I kept it simple. We're reviewing potential misuse of public HOA funds and illegal agricultural practices. No comment until the findings are finalized. Karen, never one to miss a spotlight, shoved her way forward and grabbed the mic. "This is all political," she snapped. "He's targeting me because I'm the only one brave enough to say no to backyard farming." That soundbite alone guaranteed her a place in internet meme history. Within hours, someone posted a looped video titled, "Karen Declares War on Salad," complete with laser eyes and exploding cabbages. The HOA board, now fully aware that they were sinking on a ship Karen had steered into an iceberg, began distancing themselves. Bill the treasurer emailed me privately. I didn't know she was using funds for personal gain. I thought the butterfly wall was for the community garden. I replied, "There is no community garden." He didn't respond. That evening, my office got a call from the governor's agricultural task force. They'd seen the media buzz and wanted to know if I needed backup. I thanked them but said we had it handled. Still, the fact that it reached the governor's office this fast showed just how big this had become. What started as one woman's vendetta over backyard vegetables had grown into a full-scale investigation with potential legal consequences, media attention, and enough public interest to warrant popcorn. At home, I walked through my now-cleared garden and looked over the fences where Karen's prized roses drooped like they knew the party was over. My niece was back, feeding the chickens. She pointed toward Karen's house and whispered, "Is she in trouble?" I smiled. Let's just say the weeds are finally getting pulled. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing documentation for the HOA's pesticide purchase history. Turns out, the chemicals they used were banned on residential land 2 years ago. Karen had personally signed off on it twice. It was more than hypocrisy now. It was potential criminal negligence. And I had all the receipts. Tomorrow, we'd finalize the report and hand it off to the Attorney General's office. But tonight, I planted new seeds, literal and metaphorical. More herbs. A few sunflowers. And just for fun, I ordered a state-approved hydroponic unit for vertical strawberries. The kind that Karen once called a waste of vertical space. If she thought she was done fighting with a farmer, She hadn't yet seen what happens when the whole state joins the harvest. 3 days after the audit began, the HOA looked less like a community and more like a panicked corporate office mid-scandal. Compliance trucks still lined the streets, neighbors avoided eye contact like they were afraid of being caught next, and Karen? Karen had practically vanished. Her once daily patrols with a whistle and clipboard were replaced with drawn blinds and the occasional glimpse of her scowling through the curtains. But her silence didn't fool anyone. Karen was plotting. I could feel it in my compost-loving bones. And sure enough, her next move was just as unhinged as the rest. She tried to host an emergency HOA vote to get me expelled from the neighborhood. The notice arrived on fluorescent green paper with bold capital letters that screamed, "Mandatory Emergency Residence Meeting, HOA Crisis." She called it a security session, which sounded more like a military tribunal than a housing meeting. The flyer blamed me for escalating media hysteria, state harassment, and weaponized vegetables. She didn't even try to tone it down. Her list of grievances included emotional damage caused by vine crops and hostile poultry behavior. One bullet point read, "Rogue chicken allegedly chased a toddler," to which my niece replied, "The chicken was wearing a tutu and offering snacks." The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige box of a building that usually hosted watercolor classes and awkward birthday parties. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing my usual jacket with the state seal pin proudly displayed. Karen strutted and laughed like a game show host who didn't realize her audience had already changed the channel. Her hair was styled stiff enough to deflect arrows, and she wore a sash that read HOA President, which I was pretty sure she made herself. She began the meeting with an aggressive monologue. "We are under siege," she proclaimed, pacing like she was giving a TED Talk to confused retirees. "This man has disrupted the harmony of our community, brought unwanted scrutiny, and endangered lives with his unchecked farming activity. Strawberries are not above the law." I tried very hard not to laugh, but someone in the back let out a full snort. Then came the vote. She passed out little slips of paper labeled yes and no with a question printed at the top. Should Mr. Morton be removed from Green Hills for gross misconduct? I raised my hand. Just to clarify, gross misconduct means growing food on my own property with full state certification, right? Karen didn't respond. She was too busy squinting at the slips like she was counting lottery numbers. When the votes were tallied, the result was so lopsided it was almost cruel. Out of 32 homeowners present, 29 voted no, 2 abstained, and 1 yes vote had Karen written in all caps. Her face turned the color of sunburned radishes. She started shouting about how the vote was rigged, how my badge was fake, and how the chickens were part of an agricultural intimidation scheme. Someone whispered, "They're just chickens," which only made her louder. And then, as if the gods of irony themselves were scripting the moment, the clubhouse doors flew open and in walked a group of local farmers carrying baskets of produce. Behind them was a state senator who had seen the media circus and decided to show support. One of the farmers stepped forward and said, "We heard someone around here needed a little food security." They placed the baskets, brimming with corn, tomatoes, squash, and fresh herbs, on the central table and handed out recipe cards to the residents. The room erupted into applause. Karen stormed out mid-clap, muttering something about lawsuits and conspiracy. I thanked the senator, who pulled me aside and whispered, "This is the most entertaining district visit I've had all year." Outside the clubhouse, a spontaneous community gathering began. Families brought lawn chairs, the farmers grilled corn on portable stoves, and someone set up a face-painting station near the mailbox cluster. My niece got a chicken painted on her cheek, which she claimed gave her cluck-based powers. But the moment that truly marked the turning point was when an elderly woman named Mrs. Aldridge approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've lived here for 35 years, she said. "And I haven't seen people laugh together like this in decades. Thank you, Commissioner." I told her the real credit went to the vegetables, and she gave me a hug that smelled like lilacs and nostalgia. Karen, however, wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to find my front gate open and the chicken coop ajar. 3 of my hens had wandered off, and one had made it halfway across the lawn before being scooped up by a kind neighbor. I checked the security footage and, sure enough, there she was. Karen, creeping across my yard at dawn like a villain in a low-budget soap opera. She fumbled with the coop door, tripped over the compost bin, and ran off when my motion lights activated. I sent the footage to the local police and filed a formal trespassing report. It was just another log on the ever-growing legal bonfire she'd built for herself. Later that afternoon, Karen tried to do damage control by knocking on doors with homemade pamphlets labeled, "Save Our Streets from State Control." Most people just closed the door, but one kid told her, "Mr. Morton gave me a zucchini the size of my dog." That seemed to break her. She screamed something unintelligible and walked straight into a hedge. Meanwhile, the audit reports were coming in strong. Violations were stacked so high that Lindsay called me laughing. "We could build a shed out of these," she said. There were irrigation irregularities, falsified water usage logs, and several undocumented financial transfers to beautification vendors, who turned out to be Karen's cousin and her ex-husband posing as landscapers. One invoice had an itemized charge for emergency tulip replacement at $300. I was no floral expert, but even the rarest tulips don't cost $100 a bulb. By the end of the week, our state agency submitted a formal request to the Attorney General's office for further investigation into the HOA's financial mismanagement. Karen received a notice to appear in court for both civil and possible criminal charges. She was also suspended from her HOA leadership role pending inquiry. Her throne of garden mulch was collapsing fast. That night, I stood in my garden under the porch light and watched my niece feed the chickens. Ruth, the feistiest hen, had returned triumphantly and was now perched atop the compost bin like a queen surveying her kingdom. The air smelled like tomato vines and victory. I didn't say much, just picked a cucumber and took a bite. The sweet crunch echoed louder than any speech I could have given. Karen had come at me with rules, lies, and empty threats. I answered with law, vegetables, and a community that had remembered how to come together. And the best part? I still hadn't even brought out the scarecrow. That surprise was coming soon. Court day arrived with the kind of overcast sky that made everything feel dramatic, like nature itself wanted to watch the show. Karen strutted up the courthouse steps wearing a hot pink blazer, oversized sunglasses, and a stiff smile that looked more like a grimace stretched too tight. Behind her trailed a pair of disheveled legal aides, fresh from Craigslist if I had to guess, lugging a milk crate full of mismatched folders. Her team looked like they had been prepped in a rush, like she'd promised free sandwiches in exchange for showing up. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance. Neighbors, reporters, a couple local YouTubers, and even Ruth the Chicken's Instagram fan club, who held up signs that said things like "Cluck the System" and "Hens Against HOA Tyranny." It was surreal, hilarious, and exactly the kind of circus Karen had created by trying to arrest someone over kale. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. I sat quietly at the front with my attorney, a calm and lethal woman named Darla who specialized in agricultural and municipal law. She had the pleasant demeanor of a schoolteacher and the court-crushing experience of a wrecking ball. Karen sat across from us, tapping her pen like she was trying to summon a genie. Her lawyer, a man who looked like he'd been pulled out of retirement for one last doomed job, fumbled with a coffee-stained notepad. The judge entered, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Justice Harrow, who peered over her glasses with the kind of expression that could make a chainsaw rethink its life choices. Things went downhill for Karen almost immediately. Her lawyer began by trying to paint me as a rogue operator who provoked community unrest with disruptive agricultural behavior. Darla didn't even blink. She stood and laid down our entire counterfile. Records of my legal exemption as a homeowner, my position as the state agricultural commissioner, every HOA violation Karen had committed, and a digital slideshow of evidence, including the trespassing footage, illegal pesticide use, falsified financial documents, and that fateful livestream where she cheered as I was handcuffed for picking vegetables. Karen interrupted halfway through, shouting that the video was taken out of context. The judge raised an eyebrow and said dryly, "The context seems to be you yelling at lettuce." Snickers echoed through the courtroom. Karen's lawyer shrank 2 inches in his seat. Then came the witness testimonies. Bill the treasurer, looking sheepish and more like a man who just discovered he'd been driving with a flat tire for months, admitted that Karen had pressured him to approve purchases that were, maybe not entirely community-based. He mentioned her orchid side hustle and the mysterious beautification expenses that somehow always led to her backyard. Then came Mrs. Aldridge, who told the court how Karen had banned wheelchair access to the community gazebo because the rubber wheels would wear out the bricks. Gasps filled the room. Karen muttered something about protecting historical pavement, but the damage was done. Next up, a state auditor presented the results of our investigation. He detailed how Karen had rerouted irrigation to serve only her lot, how she'd hired relatives to perform overpriced services, and how several invoices contained suspicious rounding, like charging $399.99 for emergency soil replenishment or $999 for seasonal lighting optimization. The final nail came in the form of an email we'd recovered. Karen had accidentally CC'd the wrong contact on a message that said, "Don't worry, the commissioner doesn't live here. He's just another veggie freak I'll scare off." The courtroom went still. The judge slowly removed her glasses. "You wrote this?" she asked. Karen tried to claim it was AI-generated. The judge didn't even dignify that with a reply. The ruling came fast and firm. The court found Karen guilty of abuse of power, misuse of HOA funds, unlawful trespass, harassment, and intentional defamation. Her fines totaled into the tens of thousands, and she was barred from holding any position of authority in any housing association statewide for the next 15 years. She was also required to pay restitution to every resident charged an illegitimate fee and to remove all unpermitted structures from her yard, including the infamous butterfly wall and her custom-built gazebo which, as it turns out, sat 2 inches into the neighbor's lot. Karen's face was frozen in a mask of disbelief. She tried to speak, but her lawyer put a hand on her arm and gently shook his head, silently telling her that it was over. The bailiff handed her a packet detailing the immediate actions required to comply with the court's decision. One of the YouTubers outside livestreamed her walk of shame down the courthouse step. She shoved a camera, shouted something about global conspiracies, and then tripped over a crack in the pavement. Ruth the Chicken's fan club cheered like it was a sporting event. That evening, the community threw an impromptu gathering in the common park. No one called it a celebration, outright, but let's just say there were cupcakes shaped like vegetables and a bounce house that said "Grow together, not apart." Residents mingled freely for the first time in months, trading gardening tips, homemade salsa, and shared sighs of relief. Kids played tag while parents talked about creating a new HOA leadership structure, one built on transparency and community input. As the sun dipped below the trees, I was approached by a young couple who had almost moved out because of Karen. They thanked me and said their daughter now wanted to become a garden detective. Another neighbor handed me a bottle of homemade hot sauce labeled Commissioner's Justice. I laughed and pocketed it, already planning to use it on tomorrow's breakfast eggs. Later, I returned home and stood at the edge of my garden, breathing in the scent of tomato vines and freshly turned soil. It was quiet now, peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after a storm has passed and you know, deep down, that things won't go back to how they were. They'll be better. I glanced toward Karen's house. Her blinds were still drawn, and her yard looked like it had aged 10 years in a week. No one would be knocking on her door with zucchini bread anytime soon. I turned on the garden lights and smiled at the warm glow. In one corner of the yard stood a brand new sign I had installed that afternoon. It was small, wooden, and hand-painted by the neighborhood kids. It read, "Commissioner's Coop, where good things grow." Above it, perched proudly like she owned the world, was Ruth the chicken. Watching, guarding, waiting for the next petty tyrant to try their luck. The final week of Karen's reign felt like the last sputter of an engine that had been choking on its own fumes. Her once pristine yard, once the HOA's glowing example of suburban perfection, had become a monument to overreach and poetic justice. The forced removals began one by one. The illegal gazebo was dismantled by court order, her koi pond was drained after being declared an unpermitted water feature, and the infamous butterfly wall was carted away in pieces, prompting a few kids to wave goodbye like it was a parade float. Karen remained largely unseen, retreating into her house with the blinds pulled tighter than a sealed vault, occasionally emerging only to scream at city workers removing her unauthorized topiary hedges. No one intervened. By now, even her former allies had jumped ship. Meanwhile, our neighborhood had transformed into something Karen never could have imagined, a community. Without her constant interference, residents started showing up for one another. Fences got mended together. Lawns once the source of passive-aggressive wars over blade length were now places where kids played tag. One woman even turned her driveway into a pop-up flower stand. It was like the neighborhood had exhaled for the first time in years, and all the air came back fresh. I spent those days working harder than ever on my little farm, but now with company. Volunteers from town, agriculture students, and even a few curious neighbors pitched in. They helped paint new signs, lay stone paths, and build shaded seating areas. One local farmer donated a grape trellis. Another dropped off a goat named Waffles who became an instant neighborhood celebrity. A man from 3 streets over offered to build a small greenhouse using repurposed wood from Karen's dismantled garden pergola. Nothing was wasted, just transformed. That week, we began preparing for the first ever Green Hills Harvest Festival. It wasn't something I had planned originally, but the idea grew naturally from a shared desire to mark the end of an era and plant something better in its place. There would be fresh produce stands, homemade goods, live folk music, and even a pie-eating contest. The entire event would be hosted on my land, officially endorsed by the State Agriculture Office as a model of urban food sustainability. The governor even sent over a banner to hang at the entrance that read, "From conflict to community, celebrating growth the right way." Word spread fast. Local news stations confirmed attendance. Bloggers and influencers showed interest. Vendors from nearby towns asked for space to set up booths. It became clear this was no small backyard celebration. It was a regional event now, and it all grew from one woman's desperate need for control clashing with something far more powerful than rules: purpose. On the morning of the festival, the sun rose without a cloud in the sky. Music was already playing softly as booths popped up along the pathway. Chickens wandered freely, children painted pumpkins, and the air smelled of fresh herbs and apple cider. At noon, I stood up to speak. Just a few words to thank everyone for their support and to recognize the amazing transformation that had taken place. But just as I stepped onto the small hay bale stage, a familiar shrill voice rang out from the entrance. "You can't keep me out of my own community." It was Karen. She had tried to disguise herself, but the oversized hat and sunglasses only made her stand out more. She shoved through the crowd like a shopping cart with one jammed wheel, holding what appeared to be a clipboard in one hand and a half-empty water bottle in the other. Ruth the chicken, ever the enforcer, immediately sprang into action, clucking wildly and charging toward her like she'd been waiting for this moment. Karen shrieked and backpedaled straight into a wheelbarrow full of sweet potatoes. The crowd went silent for a moment, unsure if they should gasp or laugh. And then someone yelled, "That's our HOA mascot now," and everyone burst into applause. She tried to make a scene, claiming the event was illegal, unpermitted, and full of agricultural extremists, but no one listened. A deputy assigned to monitor the festival approached her and calmly informed her that she was in violation of her court order by attempting to disrupt a state-approved event. Karen, realizing she had no allies left, no power, and certainly no authority, slunk off toward the street, muttering about writing letters to someone who probably didn't exist. The rest of the day was perfect. Families shared meals at long tables, kids ran through corn mazes, and live folk bands played acoustic covers of songs that made everyone sway like a field of wheat. Someone even dressed up Waffles the goat in a bow tie. There were speeches, yes, but mostly there was laughter, the kind that sounds like healing. The community had gone through a rough season, but it was blooming now, wild and proud. Just before sunset, I received a letter from the governor's office. It was hand-delivered and read simply, "Thank you for showing us what leadership rooted in service looks like. Let this harvest be the first of many." Attached was a certificate establishing Green Hills as a pilot site for a statewide sustainable urban farming initiative. It came with funding, educational resources, and a permanent exemption from all non-state farming restrictions. In other words, Karen could try all she wanted. She would never be able to stop us again. As twilight rolled in, I walked back toward the garden and saw my niece asleep under the grape trellis, cradling a basket of apples in her lap. Ruth the chicken nestled beside her like a sentry, eyes barely open but always watching. I picked up a watering can, gave the Rosemary one last drink, and looked around. The neighborhood, once divided by rules and petty control, now thrived with connection. It had taken a lot, humiliation, conflict, paperwork, but we had finally built something worth defending. Near the entrance, I installed a final sign made of old barn wood and hand-painted letters. It read, "Commissioner's Coop, where community grows." Below it, someone had added a smaller sign with a drawing of Karen being chased by a chicken. I didn't remove it. Some things, after all, are better left as reminders. This wasn't just a story of petty revenge or bureaucratic payback. It was proof that when people stand up, plant their roots, and refuse to be bullied, especially by those hiding behind rules they don't even follow, something incredible can grow. And in our case, it wasn't just vegetables. It was everything Karen never understood: respect, community, and the kind of peace that no clipboard could ever control.